I'm recording. There we go. And again, as always, you can find these up in the resources folder. I'm on 4 more splining. But before I go into that, we'll kind of look at where I was before, or by the end of last class. So, this was, if you recall, I'm also sharing on WebEx if you want to have this on your screen so you can kind of watch while I talk. So this is where it was at the end of last class. The splining process had been done on the hips. I had sort of worked out some of the feet animation, and I'd done all the way up the spine, splining to the head, but I hadn't done anything for the arms yet. After looking at this, I got to sort of take a little bit of a break from it, take a day's break from it, come back to it with fresh eyes, and notice a bunch of stuff that really could be improved. The way she enters the screen at the beginning felt a little off. I personally felt like there were some timing issues that were off. I make some timing changes in the stuff we're going to look at today, and looking at the final piece, I still feel like the timing is off. Timing is one of those things that I fight with a lot. So we'll talk about that in here in a minute. But this is where we were, okay? So having had that time away from it, I took a little bit of time to just try to fix some of the things I knew were issues. The first was just sort of general things, like the angle in which she comes on screen felt a little too slow. It's like she was like standing just right off camera and then started running on screen. And I wanted it to look like she was running beforehand. So I increased the spacing. I just sort of slid her back a little bit. So I'll kind of point that out. Again, if we go back to the beginning, you'll see that I kind of just changed the distance that she travels as she's moving on screen, and adjusted that to make it feel a little bit more like a jog onto the screen. I also changed, this is not it yet. I changed a little bit of the issues I have with the angle of her spine, because she was kind of running in, leaning back, and then she leans in. And I just have her leaning in all the way through now. And so a lot of what you're seeing here is just me kind of fixing those things that were troubling to me when I first watched them, or when I watched them with fresh eyes. Now this is something I want to talk about. Like this little stretch here that you see me fighting with is like, I feel like she kind of leaned, there's like a bobble in the way her hips or her root rotates her around as she turns at the top of that tree. And so I was messing around with the graph editor trying to fix that, and it occurred to me what was actually happening here. Her root control has gimbal lock. That's one. So gimbal lock is like this. It's kind of hard to explain, so I'm going to pause this and explain it to you. So that's why we had this cube up. So gimbal lock is an issue caused by rotation order. So we talked about like how Maya can calculate and generate a curve based off of wherever you put your character into a pose, but sometimes it gets it wrong, and it gets it wrong because there's an infinite number of ways you could get to that pose, right? I could, the spinning around example, I could lay down on the ground, roll over on my stomach, and then stand back up. And Maya doesn't really care. Maya doesn't distinguish between those two when it's generating that curve. It just creates one, right? Well, part of the way it decides how to create that is called the rotation order. So if you select any object in Maya and you go to the attribute editor, you'll see that we have this rotation order. This is the order in which Maya thinks you are most likely going to rotate this object, right? So for example, my character's root control is a good example of that. Maya may think that, my character's just talking like this, that the most likely angle you're going to rotate that is forward and backward, right? And that might be in the x-axis, right? And so if that's the case, you put the axis that you are going to rotate that object on the most first in that list of rotation order. So we got X, Y, Z. If we think we're going to rotate X first the most, or X most often, then that's the order you would want it in, right? And so we can see that we have our X rotation, our Y rotation, and our Z rotation, right? But this is in the local rotation axis. So as you've probably seen with the move axis, if I sort of rotate it like this and hit the move tool, my move controls are still set to the world, right? But if I hold down W and click here, you'll see I could also change it to object. And you can see that I can move this in different spaces, right? I have different ways of identifying the translation of this. This is object space, and now I'm moving it in the objects X, right? Well, rotation has the same thing. If I hit E, right now I am in object space for rotation. And currently object and world are actually the same, right? Now, the one I want to look at, though, is if I hold down E and go to gimbal, G-I-M-B-A-L, you'll see that some of those controls disappear. Now, the order in which we rotate these things change our gimbal settings, right? So X was first, and if I rotate this in X, nothing really seems to change that much on this gimbal example here. But if I rotate it in this axis, watch what happens to our X-axis. So now our X-axis is exactly the same as our Y-axis. So what if I need to rotate that thing forward, right? There's no longer an axis to use for that. And for some reason, Maya likes to use gimbal to calculate those curves as we're generating stuff in the graph editor. Which means you'll be messing around in the graph editor and you're like, oh, the Y curve must be the forward and backward rotation. And you're like, nope, it's not. And you're like, oh, the Z curve must be. And you're like, no, it's not. And you're like, oh, the X curve must be. And you're like, no, it's not. That's called gimbal lock. You are now locked without being able to adjust that axis in the graph editor. And the solution to that is, well, there is no solution to that. Like, this is just a constant battle for animators. And it's one of those things that like people have nightmares about. Like I had this like joke going earlier that like if you say gimbal lock 3 times, a man appears in the middle of the night and kills you. Like it's like terrifying. Like everybody's like, I'm terrified I'm gonna get into gimbal lock, right? You're going to, like, just get over it. You're going to have to learn to animate your way out of that. And that's what I did here. I got into gimbal lock, and now I have to figure out how to fix that little wobble, right? Some of the solutions that you'll see are some really complex rigs will sometimes have 2 controls for axes that get into gimbal lock a lot. Like the shoulder may have a backup shoulder control. And so you'll get your arm into some position where it's in gimbal lock and you'll just be like, I'm not going to animate that control anymore. I'll just start animating the new second control for it. That's a crazy solution. Sometimes you end up with gimbal lock because the rig was not rigged in an intuitive manner. Like somebody chose the wrong rotation order for something that you were planning on rotating a lot. Like your head rotates forward and back a lot. And so that should probably be your first rotation order choice, is that axis. And so like sometimes it was rigged incorrectly and you're going to end up with gimbal lock more often. Right? What you hope for is the type of gimbal lock I have right here, which is it's only affecting my object during that time where she's making a 180-degree turn. And because of that, she gets this weird wobble on that 180-degree turn. That turn only lasts like 3 or 4 frames, so I just decided to key through it. I just decided to set more keyframes and make her rotation happen exactly the way I wanted it to. So let me go up there and find it again. You'll see kind of what I'm talking about. Oh goodness, that's way further than that. Yeah, right there. So I just added some extra keys to make, when I realized that this was not getting me the result I wanted, I just added extra keys to get that rotation around to where I wanted. You can almost see the gimbal lock issues in the graph editor. It's like oh, my curve's doing something stupid. And so you gotta kind of fix it. Okay. Is that making sense? So what I would say, like I really did. I used to be like scared to animate. I'm like, oh no, I'm going to get into gimbal lock. Like your first time getting into gimbal lock, that's an opportunity to learn how to not be scared of it. Right? You're just going to work through it, and it'll be a frustrating part of the animation, but like none of it's easy. So. So after I kind of fixed those issues, I decided to retime my animation. So we talked about this yesterday, or the last class period, where using the retiming tool, plopping some stuff in here, I would find areas that I thought needed to be sped up or given a little bit more time, and I would just sort of stretch those out, right? So once she gets to the top of the tree, I felt like she gets to the top of the tree and immediately turns around and flips really quickly, right? And just for like readability, I wanted to be able to read those poses a little more clearly. So when she gets to the top of the tree, I wanted to give her just a little bit of settle time there before the flip, right? And so I'm just stretching some of those areas out. I wanted the push off from the tree to be a little harder or a little faster. I wanted the hang time to be about the same. And then I wanted that impact on the ground to be just a little bit faster, right? Just like let it hit really hard and then give her just a little bit more time on the recovery before she jumps back, right? I think it improved it a little bit. I think I probably made a couple of sections just a little too slow on the going up the tree part. I didn't really realize that until I had a little bit more distance from it and was able to look at it with fresh eyes again. But this was actually a really complicated piece of physics here, right? I mean, I know we talk about the physics class, and I'm not expecting you to break out like a piece of paper and try to calculate angular momentum. But we recognize that she's moving forward with a lot of energy, and she's changing her direction upward against a tree, pushing against the normal forces of that tree and gravity pulling her down, right? And so that's a really weird piece of like something that happens there. And so a lot of what my next video is involves fixing some of that. Actually, no, this is fixing more what the retiming broke. So I'll talk about that here in a minute. So the retiming tool did mess a couple of things up. It wasn't major. It will mess up stuff like a bouncing ball a lot more than something like this, because I don't have a ton of spots where I have adjusted tangents or anything like that. Like if you adjust a tangent and then you retime it, that tangent stays the same, but if the distance between those keyframes are different, then it still messes up your curve, right? So that's one of the reasons I like that add key tool method, is because it just pushes those keys further or closer from each other. And so I didn't have a ton of places where it really broke my timing, but I was able to see elements that were not functioning as well after I retimed it. Stuff like areas were flattening out too sharp, and I could push like as she lands, push that curve deeper. Some areas, because once you retime it, you have to snap those keyframes to whole frames again. Don't forget that part, it's very important. And when that happens, Maya has to choose, do you move that keyframe to 34 or 35? And in the space of like a one frame transition, sometimes that decision Maya makes is the wrong one, right? It made it just a little too fast by snapping that keyframe, and you have to make some minor changes to your timing. So this is a lot of that. I was doing some little tweaks on things that Maya, that my retiming had kind of, not messed up, but made less appealing, right? So after doing all this, this is sort of my new base now. Oh wait, sorry, I still have one more to go. So the fourth thing I did was I went ahead and started splining the arms. I was relatively happy with the timing now. It was time to do the curves on the arms. I'll be honest, editing the arm curves is really like, to me, not very, like it's not like you notice a huge change, right? Like there's all sorts of little noisy things in there because of how your character is moving their arms around. But sometimes like it's hard to tell, because your arms are going everywhere with your body, it's hard to tell when there's just a little bit of a change in there, right? What I'm trying to do in here is sort of a combination between adjusting the curve to add in any drag or lead that I wanted, and to use the curves to kind of make sure that after all the other changes I've made, that arm still stays in an appealing pose. You'll notice little things like your arm is swinging forward, and then suddenly it flattens out and then starts swinging forward again, and you'll just be like, that's not that. I just forgot to move the arm. I'll smooth that curve out. And so this isn't like, usually I go through this to get rid of any tiny wobbles or hitches, not necessarily because it makes a huge impact on the animation that is noticeable. Sometimes though, like editing the spline on the arms is very helpful. Like let's say I have one character who's making a lot of gestures with one hand like this, right? And the other hand just kind of hanging there, right? I'll use the graph editor to kind of add enough of that like sway in it. And it's way easier to add that stuff into the graph editor than it is to try to key all of that in. So working down the arms and into the hands, I was also trying to add in some extra drag and overshoot into stuff. So like when the hands go back and get that overshoot on that last pose, I sort of pushed that a little bit more in the graph editor and cleared up some of those arcs. So, all right. So after I've splined the whole thing and retimed the whole thing, this is what I have. This is the play last for it. Not hugely noticeable in terms of a huge change. Again, this is one of those things that you can kind of notice little bits of things. I definitely think the run-in feels better. I can still see a little bit of a bobble on that turn. So when she turns around, there's a little bit of a head bobble. I actually cleaned that up a little bit after this. But I think that that's looking better, right? The thing to notice though is that everything is still hitting pretty much on the same frames. There's a little bit of offset, but I really wanted to add some looseness to this, right? It feels like, it's kind of even hard to explain. It just feels like everything's kind of hitting together. You'll notice this much more on less dynamic animations. Like if your character's talking and doing stuff like this, like you'll feel all of those frames hitting at the same time, right? And so I still can feel some of that, and it's more like I can see areas where I wish it were like flowier, looser. So to get that, that's where I go into the offsetting step of this, right? Again, just kind of using that from the resources, the splining checklist. What I'm up to right now is I've just finished the arm controls. Now I'm on to offsetting. Okay, so one of the things I did not do on this, and I probably will go back and test it, is I didn't offset my translates and rotates on the hips. Mainly that works really well on more subtle animations. If I change my translates and move those forward, I'm going to feel it's going to mess up the feet locations. So probably how I would do that is the other way around. I would take the rotations and shift those back a little bit, or shift those later a little bit. So that's the next step. I kind of forgot and skipped that one. I offset the spine and head controls to show lead and follow, and you'll see what I do there. So like all of those controls are hitting the poses pretty much at the same time, and I want them to like feel loose, very much like the pendulum. But the way in which they feel loose is different between this and this, right? Like it's which one's leading, which one's following. After I offset down the spine, I'll offset down the arms to get like some looseness in that. Again, thinking about the pendulum. And then I'll offset each arm a little bit from each other so they're not twinning as much or hitting the same pose at the same time. So, sure. So doing that, oh crap, I keep doing this. I skipped one. I did do one more small pass before I started offsetting, which was I did a quick pass sort of fixing some of the feet contact issues. I felt like it still needed some more weight on each of those impacts, particularly the one on the ground there, and And so what I'm doing on some of this is breaking tangents on the feet, so I can feel those feet smack the ground a little harder. This is where I was worried about that momentum as she was running forward and up the tree, trying to figure out how that physics would work, right? She would slow down because she's going upward against gravity, but if she slows down too much, it's going to feel like she's not going to make it up the tree, right? And so it's a really like delicate back and forth to make those things work. And so this video, that's what I was kind of focusing on, was getting that up the tree and getting each step to feel more weighty. So how they smack the ground and how deep the hips dip up and down on that. So hopefully you can see some examples of that. During this stage, some of these changes are super minimal, like super like subtle. And so the only way I can tell is by play blasting it and seeing if it looks better, right? And so you see me play blast a couple of times in here, and you'll also notice I do that thing where I play blast it and flip it. So I'm watching that, I'm like, I think that looks better, let me flip it really quick and see. And I think it was, again, I think it got a little bit soft on the timing. So this is before I did my offsetting. This is the play blast for it. And again, you can kind of see like it's still feeling a little stiff, particularly in the arms to me. And so that's what this offsetting pass is about. This is where I'm offsetting first down the spine. I always just try this to see if it works. I select down the spine and I just try shifting the spine one frame after the hips, and then the head one frame after the spine. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it breaks your character's neck. And in this case, it broke my character's neck. I'll kind of go back there and show you right there. That's what I was getting when I did that, when she was in the air. And I realized that I just have to try that because I get more information about what the animation actually needs when I do that. And so what I realized is that like sometimes that works. But by doing that, your character is going to feel more like the hips are leading and the head is following, dragging behind, right? And I realized that felt very like lackadaisical. She doesn't feel very like energized by doing that. That feels very like tired, and that's not what this animation is going for. So I realized I needed to offset some stuff to lead and other things to follow. So the result of that is that I just undid all of those shifts that I just did. And for the first half of the animation before the flip, I did have, actually I think for the entire animation, I did have the spine one frame behind the hips. For the head though, the first half of the animation, I had it dragging a frame behind. And then the second half of the animation, I had it a frame or two ahead. And what that means is as she's coming back up from that landing, she's leading that motion with her head like she's ready to fight, right? She's got some energy, right? I feel like we've kind of gone past that point here. And so you can kind of see that I'm just sort of shifting those around a little bit to make it feel like she goes up with her head first, right? The next thing I do is kind of go down the arms. Again, I tried just a basic offsetting all the way through, but she has some very specific hand poses and arm poses she hits in the flip. And so I started messing those up. So again, I undid that. Instead, I added drag down the arm. So I offset down the arm as she's running at the beginning. I left all of the jump alone. I think that makes sense because I think to be able to make that jump, you're not just flopping around through the air, right? You are hitting some very precise poses. It probably would be more stiff, right? And so that part doesn't have very much offset in it. But then again, at the end where her arms sort of follow through, I'm having those drag one frame behind. The last thing I did is I chose the right arm to lead in the ending of the animation. When she pulls back, I wanted her right arm to go back first and then her left arm. And at the beginning of it, I think I did the opposite of that. I had her, because I wanted, as she's running up the tree, I wanted it to feel like she reaches up the tree with that arm before her spine gets there, right? So some shifting of some keyframes of the entire arm motion. And it's really subtle. Like when we watch the difference between these, it's not something that just like, wow, that's a huge difference. It's really subtle differences, but I do think it loosens it up. The last thing I did is after I did all that offsetting, it actually made her wrists feel too loose at the very last of that. I like the drag back, but it overshot too much. And so I just sort of corrected that pose a little bit there. So, so the result of that and where I currently am is this. So I'm going to do some self-critique. I feel like there's a couple of spots that still feel a little weird to me. Right before she anticipates, before jumping up the tree, I feel like it slows down just a bit there. Like it's kind of like she hangs in the air a little too long before popping down. Some people last class were saying that they thought the flip in the air felt a little too slow. I'm not sure about that. That might actually be that that it doesn't have any motion blur. And so what you're seeing is the individual frames of her in the air flash really fast. Whereas if you look at the reference, he just kind of looks like a quick blur. And I think once I render that with motion blur, it'll help some of that. I am going to do an attempt because this is a good thing to practice. Your art director might come to you and say, "Oh, that's really cool. Can she jump maybe like 5 feet away from the tree instead of 2?" And you're like, "Really?" Like, and you don't want that to like ruin your life. So like practicing how to make those like big sweeping changes is cool. Like the reason that's really good is because it takes 15 minutes. You can always undo it, and it might make your animation better. If it doesn't make your animation better, you have a better animation. If it doesn't make your animation better, you learn from that experience, right? You at least learn how to try to make it better, right? So to me, it's worth trying it, even if it takes like 20 minutes, 30 minutes to see if that jump can go just a touch further. I have a feeling I like it where it's at, but I don't know. I'm going to try it. I still feel like there's a little bit of a timing issue. Some people said that jump back felt a little fast. I don't know. I'm okay with it. What do you all think? I'm petitioning for feedback because I plan on pushing this all the way to the end. What could be improved on it?
I don't think the jump is too slow. I think the art looks like it dips down right there.
I wonder if that's because of how big her head is, but still, like I probably do just need to push her up just a touch. I kind of agree. Like it's that how low her head goes during that flip is like way down here, right?
It's because the shape changes so much.
Yeah.
I think maybe the reason people think it's slow is because they're looking at the reference and it is quicker. But I think the child is landing close. I mean, your reference is landing closer to the tree, and in your animation, she's landing farther, so it would take more time.
But I think you're right, and I think you're also right. She's weighted differently, and that big head makes it look like when she's spinning through the air, it makes it look like she's like dipping too low. So I think you're right. I think it's a combination of the two things you just said as well. So I want to push it. Areas you think it could be like pushed though? Like what's some things that would make it stronger?
I think the run.
Is the run still like needing more exaggeration? Or?
It's like when she starts here. It's like I don't know. It seems like you could kind of. I think you could stretch into it a bit more, kind of.
So at the beginning of, I guess she's just coming on screen.
She seems kind of a little,
I could see that. Yeah.
You said that you were going to maybe add something to the scene like a robot going over exactly material. This is sort of action scene.
Yeah.
I think in the reference, the kid does a lot of little steps because he's like preparing to do his backflip. But I think that we're going to definitely like impose some more, push more to show that this is an action sort of run rather than a sort of preparation. Maybe she can like sort of pull in a little bit right at the end prepared for that flip. But I do think that her movement, her arms a little bit more will all that.
I think you're right. I think that the run in is feeling very vanilla. It doesn't feel urgent. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like she's like, and you should just have her just go like
Like just big, like reaching strides, like.
Yeah, like that. She's doing.
Gotcha. 2 small steps. Yeah, I think you're right. I think I was trying to get her to. I see what you're saying. Like she's being cautious as she approaches the tree, and she needs to be like.
If she's trying to fight someone, then she knows she's about to flip off this tree and get him. So she should just be like, yeah.
Gotcha.
And like turn around.
When she goes up in and her hands aren't really like grabbing her knees like the kids is, and so it's not feeling as restrictive.
That's a good point. Like the flip, like she does the like grab her knees thing, but it's only there for 1 frame, and it's such a fast flip. I think there needs to be 1 more frame where she's kind of holding her knees, traveling around from that. Yeah, I agree with that.
I think when she jumps, I don't know, this might, when she jumps off the tree, there's a split second where her arms are kind of down as her upper body turns. So like his go up almost immediately. So like I think that might be a bit too slow, like right there.
Where she like pulls her arms up?
Yeah.
So you can whip those up faster?
Like a little bit, actually, because she might linger there a little bit too long, and I feel like that makes, I don't know, it might not be.
No, I like that idea. I think that'll definitely increase the timing, because that is a little bit of a sluggish pulling the arms up.
That way she looks like.
So, I only ask you to tear my work apart every now and then. Anybody, any more comments? Yeah.
When she's going up onto the tree, I know she's not supposed to be putting her hand on the tree and letting go at it. So she's trying to.
I could check reaches for it.
Like it looks like her hand stops at some second, like you can.
I see. Like it's hitting like a. So maybe have that like swing through a little bit more. I like that. Other comments? I'm using you all for free feedback, but all right, cool. So so here's what I would say is wherever you're at right now, you can probably get useful notes from somebody. I think it's a good practice to periodically just ask somebody, hey, what do you think of this? Like, what could be better about this? It's scary to ask people that because you're really probably worried that they're going to tell you something that creates 3 more hours of work for you, right? And I get that, like, especially when you are in an environment where you have stuff coming due, you have other things due, but this really is like, you know, pushing for a quality piece. It will pay off to be asking for that feedback now. So, so sort of the last thing I'll mention, we were talking about rendering this again. I don't want you to necessarily put a ton of time into the things that are not animation, but at the same time, this carries no like scene emotion at all, right? Like this is just there's no lighting information in this at all. And just putting something in here in terms of light will give me another layer of appeal, and appeal is one of the parts of animation, right? So the other thing about that is, on more than one occasion in the recent past, people have asked me for copies of students' work. Like they've said, hey, I am looking to hire someone. Can you send me a couple of examples of somebody's work? Jonathan is currently redoing our website and wants to showcase some of your work. And I recognize that I very rarely have finished pieces that I can just be like, yeah, here, dig through my character animation folder. My answer is usually like, you can go look in the character animation folder, and if there's anything worthwhile in there, I can try to contact that student and see if they still have that file so they can render it. Like, and that's not the answer you want, right? That literally will someday cost you a job. So getting in the habit of making your animations a finished piece means that I can quickly pass that off at whatever stage it is, right? And so that's one of the reasons that, like, even though this is not a lighting and rendering class, this is not a modeling class, doing enough to where those elements, the modeling and the lighting and rendering, add to your animation instead of take away from your animation, like that's a big plus, right? So so like I said, I want to keep working on mine, and I'm going to try to see if I can hit the same deadline you all have to hit. I know you have a lot of classes, but I have somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 pages worth of academic documents I have to write soon. So feels like an even trade-off. So yes. I did not. The second day in a row. You're all here. I know, my New Year's resolution was to be skinny, but that's not going to happen either. No, I will pick that back up next week. The ID tech stuff, huh? Keeping me accountable. But everybody is here, right? Yes. Say aye if you're not here. Okay. All right. So the rest of the day is, or the rest of the class is yours. Unless you have some questions that are like full class questions. Anybody have any questions, comments on any of this stuff? Going once? Going twice? Oh, does anybody have any questions? Yeah. So the rest of the class may be just sort of hopping around, checking out what you're working on. How many of you are in portfolio next? Okay. I will also be visiting you, the ghost of Christmas future. So I'll be hopping in there tonight is the kickoff for the animation test round 1. Yeah. I actually do have a couple of last minute things I need to pull together for that, so I will also be kind of tinkering on that a little bit toward the end of class once I've kind of gone through some questions. So otherwise, the rest of the class is yours. Yay!